start yelling at me.
Right.
Just kidding.
Well, thank you all for joining, and I look forward to the panel and the discussion we had this morning. I just want to quickly run through the some of the key findings, some of the key insights. Just leave you with a few ideas from the ballot guide on your table. Please take 1, 2, 5, 20. Distribute. If you have any questions about how you can share, please let us know. We want to use this as a resource for Coloradans, for your constituents, for your members, as a piece of information to inform the debate. We don't put in our ballot guide how to vote. We don't say vote yes, vote no. We look at the issues through the lens of our principles, of the lens of free enterprise, asking the questions I think many of you asked in terms of what will the impact of these items be on our economy, on my business, on my kids' future. And so we try to articulate those issues and how maybe a layer or two below the headline what the implications might be. Now I will say you haven't worked it out. This ballot is complicated. The issues are actually fairly complex. A few months ago, we were looking at what was qualifying, and we were sort of joking, well, we don't have 2,500-foot setback. No, we don't have a $2 billion paid leave. Maybe we could sleep on the ballot. But, in reality, when we start digging in, there are actually some very consequential issues that are, I think, very relevant for the future of our state, for the future of our economy, for the future of, how we create public policy and what it means to sort of create sustainable programs. So I will leave you with a few of those insights, but I do encourage you to dig into the ballot guide. There are full reports on each of these issues that you can spend more time with some light reading. So the first issue, Proposition 121, this is a state income tax reduction. Now, I will say we only studied 3 statewide issues and 1 issue from the city of Denver. It's, for those of you in this city of Denver, City County of Denver will face on the ballot. So one of our first statewide issues, Proposition 121, looking at the state income tax reduction. If you recall, last year we had a similar incremental rate reduction. This asked voters whether or not we will reduce the statewide income tax rate. We currently have a flat income tax rate, both on the individual and corporate side, reduce it from 4.55 to 4.4%. Similar to what we did last year, we did a dynamic analysis to look at, okay, how does this impact the economy in terms of job growth, in terms of GDP growth, and what are the impacts over multiple years? What we found is that over the first 5 years, Proposition 121 would save Coloradans about $1.6 billion over those first 5 years. The largest impacts would occur in the first 2 years. In the first year, specifically next year, because the tax is retroactive for the current tax year and would be applied in the 23 tax year. And so taxpayers would accrue more than $700 million in savings next year. The total employment impact on jobs against the baseline was about 9,600 jobs, primarily led by private sector growth of about 9,100 jobs. Public sector grew by about 510 as well. Questions on how this impacts spending. Because we have a projected surplus through the Tabor mechanism, we have excess revenue projected to refund back to taxpayers. At least in the first 2 years, this would not reduce money available for state spending directly. In future years, the projected tax reductions would sort of lower state spending, although we would expect state spending to continue to grow annually against the baseline. Next, Proposition FF. This is a referred measure, so this is not a citizen-led measure. This is referred by the state legislature earlier this year. So this would propose to fund free lunches for all K-12 students. So currently, about 270,000 students out of 900,000, approximately 900,000 K-12 students receive free meals at school through largely through federal programs. This would now cover or make eligible about 615,000 additional Colorado students, so that every student, if their district were to opt into this program, would have free access to free healthy meals. This is, in essence, funded as a progressive income tax. And as our senior economist, Dr. Byers, who's here, likes to remind us, and as you're taught in Econ 101, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So this is funded through a reduction in federal income tax deductions on high-income earners, those making more than $300,000 a year, which would raise approximately about $100 million to pay for the program. Now, I think the key insight, or what we really wanted to emphasize and focus on as we think about not just the impacts on students and those families that would potentially benefit, but think about how this program is being set up. It's generating revenue to the general fund by reducing these federal tax deductions, which would enter as general money, and it sets up this program that would, again, pay for these meals through our Colorado Department of Education, but the fund and the tax mechanism are not linked. So the question is, will the tax be sufficient to pay for these additional meals? So we have some underfunding risk, especially in the long run. If the growth in the tax revenue does not grow at the same rate that the growth in the program, which is, I will say, is more than just healthy meals. It also provides grants to local schools, a few $1 million, and increases food worker wages slightly as well. So there's some additional program spending included in this. But if the growth in food costs and inflation costs would continue, it's possible we face some unfunding risk. So by 2023, under several scenarios in our mid-range, we saw a deficit of about $330 million. But there is actually more significant overfunding risk, meaning this becomes more of a general tax increase, a broad tax increase, as the actual costs of paying for the program are much lower than the program costs. And this would then become, either require oversight to limit the tax increase, but currently in this provision in the measure, there's no mechanism that would do that. Proposition 123, you'll hear more about this measure on our panel, and this research was led by our housing fellow, Peter Lafari. So I'm happy to steal some of his thunder. No, wanted to present some of the findings and some of the analysis from his great work, highlighting some of the questions that surround this issue. This is another question about whether we create a new state program. The state would dedicate 1/10 of 1%, so 0.10% of federal taxable income, approximately $300 million in the first year, $290 to $300 million in the first year, to be dedicated to housing affordability programs, affordable housing programs across land banking, they call it concessionary debt, affordable housing ownership, homelessness, local government capacity. And the question, and I think what's really important that I hope Peter can kind of talk a little bit more about and is highlighted in the report, is that the measure puts some very aspirational requirements on municipalities that choose to opt in. And so those aspirational targets we see, and the analysis of those, would be very beneficial to the housing development market and addressing affordability in terms of a 3% growth target for affordable housing units as defined in the measure. Fast track approval for permitting. However, these requirements are fairly stringent against where most municipalities are today. And that would, given there are ways through the regulatory process for the state agencies to maybe loosen some of those, potentially limit or mitigate some of the positive impacts of the measure. Now, and so we highlight ways in which we think either through future legislative action or holding true to the measure in the regulatory process could live up to the measure without sort of watering down some of these requirements. As I highlight here in one of the charts, we actually modeled out under a couple different affordability definitions for how that 3% growth target would look for every county. So you can go look at your county and see what 3% growth would mean to try to hit based upon the affordability targets in the measure. And again, as you can see, it is fairly aggressive. So 3% statewide under this sort of middle range, using a 4-person family household definition on affordability would require about 21,000 units. And we permit somewhere in the range of 30 to 50,000 in a good year. So this is substantial, and while it would be incredibly beneficial and have a huge impact on supply, there are real questions about at the price point that would require whether that is feasible. So hopefully some more discussion on that. As I said, I leave you with more questions than answers. This gets complicated, but this is an important issue. I think if it's in your sort of world or something that you look at, important to really understand some of these details. And finally, the City of Denver Ordinance 305. This is no eviction without representation. This would raise a tax, impose a $75 tax on every rental unit in the city to fund access to universal legal coverage for access to a lawyer, right? So right now you have a criminal defense lawyer, the defense lawyers, they don't operate in the space of civil eviction. So this would give anyone facing eviction in the city of Denver access to legal representation. The projections and what you'll see on the ballot is what's estimated is about a $12 million tax increase overall. And what we highlighted, and again, questioning how the tax increase sort of adds up relative to the projected cost of this program. We looked at similar programs as outlined in San Francisco, New York. We looked at existing records on how much the state currently spends on these sorts of programs, as there are significant existing resources for renters facing eviction, both prior to eviction in terms of rent support, in terms of consultation. We looked at these programs and how much, the expected sort of legal cost would be, and we modeled it out across the highest case of evictions we saw in the city of Denver, which was in 2010. There was about 10,000 evictions. We modeled it in what was, the rate of eviction we saw last year, which was about 4,000, and what the projected cost of the program. And we estimated that this would raise in excess of what the projected cost would be, in the range of $10 to $5 million. So on the low end, under the highest use scenario, lawyers are not as productive, they cost a lot. It would still raise about $5 million more than the projected cost would be. And again, there's no mechanism in there to potentially lower that tax increase or right size the cost. And this would become, again, likely a general tax increase, sort of reportedly as a measure to fund eviction representation legal support. Now, the other point that I will make from an economic standpoint, I think is highlighted in our work and elsewhere, is that it's very evident when you have these sorts of tax increases, they're passed on to renters. So this becomes a cost increase when we're already facing affordability. But I think beyond that is the $75 a year per unit is significant, but as now landlords face higher representation on the tenant side, in cases where it may not even benefit the tenant, they may not even change necessarily the outcome, it delays the process, it adds costs, those are also passed on to tenants as well. And I think those would be more significant than the direct cost itself. So there's more information in the ballot guide, and I want to turn it back over to you, Kristen, to introduce our panel. Thank you.
And I'm sure everybody does have some questions for Chris. We will do questions from the audience at the very end of the program, so hold those thoughts. Chris, I know will be available too after today. Now to the panel discussion. I'm going to introduce each panelist and then invite you up to the stage to get your mics situated. Starting with Peter Lafari. So Peter is the Executive Director of Maker Housing Partners, a socially conscious public housing authority based in Adams County. His role as Executive Director, Lafari leads a passionate team committed to ending the cycle of generational poverty by providing individuals and family with access to affordable housing. Peter was also a 2021 Terry J. Stevenson Fellow and co-authored a groundbreaking report last year on housing for CSI. In 2022, we're fortunate to still have Peter on the CSI team as our 2022 Housing Fellow. Peter, welcome. For over a decade, Larry Yonker served as president and CEO at Springs Rescue Mission, which helps citizens who are struggling with mental illness or addiction and who find themselves homeless in our community. He served as board chairman of Citygate Network, a 300-member association of rescue missions across North America, and the Downtown Partnership. CSI is thankful to have Larry on this year as an expert contributor to an upcoming homelessness report we'll release next month. Larry, welcome. And a familiar face, Mitch Morrissey, has been with CSI for nearly a year as one of our criminal justice fellows. He previously served as the elected district attorney for the 2nd Judicial District covering Denver from 2005 to 2017. He is internationally recognized for his expertise in DNA technology and applying that technology to solve crimes. He has trained law enforcement officers and prosecutors throughout the U.S. and the world, and he currently runs a company that solves cold cases with DNA and investigative genetic genealogy. Mitch. And Jason Galvin is a CSI Education Fellow. He has spent his professional career working at the intersection of the business and nonprofit sectors. He's a partner at Oak Rose Group and a strategy consulting firm specializing in education, workforce development, and economic mobility. From 2015 to 2020, he worked with America Succeeds, a national network of business leaders focused on modernizing the nation's education system. He co-authored the report, The Age of Agility, Education Pathways for Future of Work, an initiative that empowers business leaders, educators, and policymakers to better prepare students for the new workforce and economy. Jason. And lastly, our esteemed moderator today, Ed Sealover. Ed is a senior reporter for the Denver Business Journal. Ed has been at the DBJ for 13 years, covers government, economic development, transportation, hospitality, and my favorite columns, brewing and restaurant. He has won over 140 awards in categories ranging from investigative reporting to beat reporting, and he was honored as the 2020 Colorado Journalist of the Year. Ed, welcome.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here today to hear what we hope is going to be a very substantial discussion of some of the issues that are going to be facing us all on the ballot this year. And thanks for all of the panelists for coming out today as well, too. I think the way we're going to do this is we're going to go right down the line here, probably talking for about 8 to 10 minutes each about these issues. And so I'll direct questions specifically to each of you, but anyone, feel free to jump in here, especially if it kind of segues over into your area. So let's start with Proposition 123. Peter, you've been studying this. First of all, this is not the world's easiest ballot initiative to understand. Why don't you walk us through exactly what this does and how this could affect affordable housing?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And first, it's great to be here. Thanks everybody for spending your precious time with us today. It's my pleasure to be able to share with you the findings from the report. You know, it's not a surprise that we're struggling to build housing for Coloradans, and we've been doing so for some time. You know, the last time that we really invested in housing America was after the brave men and women came back from World War II. And we created an entire ecosystem to be able to stably house Americans and allow them to thrive. And so since that time, we've somewhat abandoned that. We've gone somewhat dark when it comes to being able to facilitate the types of housing that is required for Coloradans to thrive. We don't build starter homes anymore. We decided that that was not in our best interests. We started to over-regulate the housing market to the point of inaction. And so only the upper quintile of Coloradan earners are thriving right now when it comes to being able to access an affordable and available home. And so, we have a shortage of home units in Colorado, anywhere between about 96,000 units up to a little over 200,000 units. My co-fellow and I, Evelyn and Lim, we came in like right in the middle of that. And so, this measure looks to take on that challenge head on, but to kind of harmonize with our culture of local control. It has voluntary elements as opposed to surgical statewide interventions, which is one gamble the measure makes. The other gamble the measure makes is that in a culture that is really governed by and ruled the ethos of Tabor, instead of raising taxes, the measure asks to transfer 0.1% of federal income, as Chris mentioned previously, to be able to, somewhat sidestep the Tabor discussion, although that's really what we're talking about with the measure. And through that dynamic, it has the potential to crowd out or put pressure on other critical state budgetary needs, because it takes that 0.1% from the general fund. And so, as a houser, as a believer in the foundational positive elements and the positive externalities that an affordable home provides, many of us believe that there will be synergistic positive impacts on those other critical state budgetary needs, but we're fixing to find that out, right? And so at the end of the day, we have to demonstrate to Coloradans that their investment is properly returned to them in the form of affordable units as well. And that really comes back to the last gamble of the measure, which is that, as I mentioned earlier, which is will local governments opt in? And so the measure tries to take about $300 million and infuse that unit count that Chris shared earlier. And so, we present in the report for you to consider, is that feasible? It is a pretty significant walk from where we are historically, even with the increased housing unit starts that we've experienced over the last 2 years specifically. It's a pretty significant jump. And so the measure is aspirational. The measure has transformational elements, but there are concerns that we're going to have to grapple with if the will of the voters passes there.
Hey, Ed, can I
Yes,
jump in real quick?
absolutely.
This has nothing to do with homelessness, but I happen to know a little something about sound systems. We all put our mics on our left side and we're all looking to the moderator on our right side. And I can tell the folks back there are having a hard time getting the sound system right. So let's switch our lapel or speak this way so that the audience can hear.
Spoken like a true educator.
Wow.
Thank you, Jason.
Jason, we're going to switch the topic to technology. We'll get to you here.
Appreciate that.
So Peter, you've explained that this has some big goals here, some aspirational aspects to it. How much of a difference can this make? I mean, 300 million is a big number, and it's something we've never done before. But when you look at the size of the affordable housing crisis in the state, is that going to make a difference? And do we have the potential of just fixing housing in pockets, because this is about opting in for local governments rather than actually having a good statewide affordable housing policy?
Yeah, every dollar counts. This will be braided, synergized with existing funding streams, some one-time only via ARPA funds. The state's dedicated over $1 billion in the last 2 fiscal years. So it will make a difference. I think, though, that the elements of the measure, when looked at in totality, is really where we start to see the potential for transformational change. Unit targets for any local government that opts in, they're committing to a 3% per annum increase in their blended affordable stock, right? So that's unprecedented, that's different, and goals matter, right? So what we measure, we achieve. So I would state that. We are far too slow when it comes to approving completed development projects, which the fast track approval process is looking to address. And so when you look at the money, you look at the growth targets, and you look at how we actually get that dream to reality, now we're cooking with something special. But we require local governments to belly to the bar, and then they have to continue to come back, right? And so those are some big ifs. And so what I would say is that, yes, absolutely, there could be considered a first mover advantage, right? So local governments that opt in first may be competing against less local governments. Human nature for some local governments to say, you know what, we're just not going to jump in the pool yet. We're going to see how that first cohort fares. There could be disproportional allocation of the funds based off of local government representation. So that is a concern. That is something that permeates the Capitol consistently, as you are aware of. And so all of those things are on the table, but most importantly, if the will of the people see this as a measure to approve, we're going to need local governments to match the audacity and change some of those behaviors.
Right. Note to the mayors that I see in the audience here. One more thing, and you mentioned this, but I don't think we should just skip over this. The funding is a unique method for a ballot initiative. Walk through how it works and walk through how it could affect the rest of the state budget, because this is not a win-win. This is a little bit of a win take from elsewhere scenario, isn't it?
Yeah, you know, again, the proponents believe that, you know, by investing in affordable housing, it's going to have those positive externalities on all other eligible budgetary needs. By saying that and not raising taxes, we are going to find that out if it passes, right? So how does this interface? This is one of the reasons the proponents say, look, you know, hey, Peter, CSI, this has nothing to do with the JBC. And we say, actually, it has a lot to do with the JBC, because the JBC is going to be tasked with ensuring that those other critical budgetary needs, so the money moves away from the general fund, right? And it moves into a affordable housing fund, which is not governed by the JBC. But the JBC is going to be evaluating how it interfaces with the other critical state budgetary needs that they will be allocating from that general fund. And so in Tabor plus years, it reduces your Tabor refund commensurately, as we described in our report. But also in non-Tabor years, non-Tabor fund years, what we're going to see is that it's going to have that interface. Now, there is a fail-safe in the measure, one of two. There's another one on the administrative side, but the measure does allow for diversion of funds to address that type of concern of crowding out. But it remains to be seen if that will be successful. It remains to be seen whether or not there will be an appetite to deploy that measure, considering the will of the public. And so there's lots of volatility within the measure, but I think the key element we all need to understand, as Coloradans and as a houser, as somebody who has boots on the ground working with folks that are struggling to stay housed, is that the status quo is untenable. We have to do something to be able to address moving housing units to production and free our market accordingly. And so there will be an interface with these other budgetary needs, as you mentioned, Ed. This is unique in this manner. The proponents could have said, let's tax ourselves. Let's see if the will of the Coloradan people will accept that. They decided to go a different route, and we're going to understand whether or not that bears fruit come this fall.
Okay. Well, thank you for that high level look at it here, and we may come back to this. And again, we'll have audience questions at the end for anyone you want to work for Chris. So please save them up and think about it. But I want to move to a couple of topics that are not necessarily ballot questions, but are going to be fresh on everyone's mind as they go to the polls this year. First of all, the topic of homelessness. Larry, you are someone who has dealt with this for many years here. Now I also want to make sure I get my numbers right here, because I know that CSI released a report this year on total being spent in Metro Denver, and that is over $500 million to address homelessness at this point. And I understand CSI is in the process of updating this report for an October release. So give us a little preview here. Why are we spending this much? How much could things change? What more are you finding out about what we're spending and why here in Metro Denver on homelessness?
Well, it's obviously a big community issue, and that's now on a national level. And so it's gotten worse, and housing certainly plays a part in that. So you look at the areas that really grew rapidly in homelessness, very expensive areas, Los Angeles, Seattle, Portland, areas where people wanted to live. First of all, I want to thank the CSI for allowing me to be a part of this and working with Jamie Van Leeuwen, who was Governor Hickenlooper's homeless road home guy. And we see things through different filters, and it's been a really, really great dialogue. So I think the report's going to be a great update. But beyond just numbers, you look at the big number, and everybody goes, "Wow, why are the numbers still getting worse? Why are we still getting more and more homeless?" I think that speaks to the complexity of homelessness and the diversity of homelessness. But I think the biggest thing we're trying to do now is to bring some ideas and some thinking and some solutions to the elected officials, and particularly mayors, but certainly elected officials and business communities and community members to begin to work together and to begin to collaborate, look for best practices. And I think that the report's going to have a lot to offer in those areas, not just a report on how much money we're spending.
Break down that 500 million though. I mean, where is that? That's a big number. What are we spending on, and where is the money coming from?
Well, you'll see on the slide up there, kind of the sources of funds. The funds are being used. I'll say this: in Colorado Springs, we started this project when Steve Bach, the first strong mayor, called for homeless services in Colorado Springs, and he and his wife had visited San Antonio and brought back the concept of a homeless resource campus. Call for developers and call for people. Well, it was kind of crickets, except for the Springs Rescue Mission. When I was just becoming the CEO of Springs Rescue Mission, we raised our hand and said, we believe this is right. We went down and visited San Antonio, Maricopa County, and a few other places. But the biggest thing was this collaboration, this cooperation, and that was San Antonio did. They actually built a 22-acre campus, largely funded initially by private funds. It was a private funder who threw in $50 million and did a jump ball for all the other funding agencies to come together. And so they forced anybody who received funding for homeless services from any of the agencies, state, federal, they had to be on this campus. Not saying that single campus is the only solution, but it certainly is a great solution. And so we decided we had to do that when John Suthers ran for mayor. We had done our due diligence and we had some plans drawn up. We took every dime we had to create these architectural plans. We happened to be located in the primary area where homelessness was at by the river, by the creek. And so it seemed like the right thing to do in the right location. Not that we didn't have NIMBYism, but we certainly were in an area where we didn't bring homelessness to that area. Homelessness was already there. So I think that the biggest thing about it is the collaboration. The city bought into it. We got 100% of their CDBG money the first year and if we hadn't got that grant, honestly, from the city, it would have never happened. It was just too big a risk, and we didn't have a track record to prove that we could pull something like that off. So that was kind of I've dedicated the last 10 years of my life to this issue. I'm very passionate about it. I think first of all and foremost, the people deserve more than to be laying on sidewalks and pitching tents on sidewalks. I think that if we approach it from that standpoint, is what would you expect the end to look like? That was what we built our campus around. We looked at the end and said, what would I want my uncle or my dad to experience if he was homeless? And so we pulled all the agencies, the best in the community together and did this campus. So hopefully we're not highlighting anybody in the state. We're looking around the country to other best practices and studying those. But it's been a real privilege to be a part of this.
Let's talk about a couple of those practices. First of all, and I want you to explain some of these terms here, because I know not everybody is as familiar as policy wonks are here, but there is debate around the idea of housing first as a practice. What is that? And how have you looked at whether that is an effective method of reducing homelessness?
Well, housing first was first introduced by George Bush under his compassionate care program, and then escalated by President Obama. Conceptually, obviously, in housing, when you relate to housing is stabilization. You got to stabilize people. So certainly, the name is a little problematic because politically, or I should say, policy-wise, it became in some cases housing only. And that's a bad deal. That's a bad program because having started in the shelter is housing, and especially good tiered shelter where you're not just warehousing people, but you're actually investing in the health and mental health of the people at a stage where they can handle. First of all, you're bringing them back into community. You're bringing them back into relationship with one another, which is a real key to drug addiction and some of those things, is to be in community. That's why they form tent cities, and bad things happen in tent cities. And good things happen in structured, organized, tiered shelters. So housing first is an oversimplification. It still works for certain percentage of the population, but it isn't an end all to homelessness. And I think some of the things we've done in housing first have been detrimental to the people and to the community, because I think that you're throwing people into housing. We have a permanent supportive housing. We're first in Colorado Springs, one of the first in the state that is 100%, 30% AMI. So that's 30% annual median income. So this is the very lowest of the low. And so one of the things that the people that came from the rescue mission did fairly well because they had been stabilized. The people that came from the community didn't do very well because they weren't ready. They weren't ready to be housed. So housing first is an oversimplification, really, of it's not an end all for homelessness.
Let me throw one more concept at you here that I think we're going to begin talking about a lot more in the next year here in the Denver area, and that is basic income.
Mhm.
Denver is experimenting with a basic income program now. What is that? Does that work in other cities from what you've seen to reduce homelessness?
I think conceptually it has worked, and I think that again, everything is about execution and implementation. If you don't execute, great plans poorly executed never work. Mediocre plans well executed work better. And so I think that some of the things that are it's all in the execution of this. I think it could play a role. I think how is it integrated into the plan? I think that's all to be played out. The criteria for selection, what's going to be expected of the people who get the money. What kind of programs can you implement for these people? Because housing is just one piece of their problem or one piece of their issue. They became homeless for a reason. And so are we going to deal with all those issues at the same time? If it does work, $9 million, most of which is private, that's a good thing, I think. I think we're taking more private funds, and private people typically are more scrutinized more their investment oftentimes than private funders do. But I think we'll see if it works, and I'm certainly open to. I think one of the things you'll see in this report, we're open to everybody at the table. We want everybody at the table to offer their solutions, but let's find a way to work together. Let's create a structure. Let's change the system. The system's got to change. And I believe it needs to happen at the city level, but I think that the systems have to change. You've got to work together, and someone's got to coordinate all these different things. We already have a COC. Largely, the continuum of care manages just the HUD money and doesn't do a lot with the rest of the funding. And so oftentimes that's not coordinated. It's coordinated by priorities set in Washington, and those priorities aren't the same for Colorado Springs, and they aren't the same. May be the same for Denver or Aurora. So I think that again, it's the coordination and the use of this $500 million in a coordinated effort is going to be the key.
And just for those who haven't read about it, the Basic Income Project will give $12,000 to a number of people now experiencing homelessness over the next year to see if it can break them out of the cycle of homelessness and into self-sustainability. It'll be a first for Denver. Let me move on now to the issue that is possibly 1A, right up there with inflation in most polls for voters heading into this election, and that is the issue of crime. Mitch, you know a little bit about this. Let me just start with the question I think everybody wants to know. Why are we seeing such a spike in Colorado in crime right now? And in kind of a nature versus nurture debate, is this because of policies that have changed in the recent years? Is it because we've gone through a world-changing pandemic? A little bit of both? What's happening?
Well, I do know a lot about crime, and was told I could bring my book, which is a history of crime in the Mile High City. If you're interested in the history of crime in Denver, you can go on Amazon, and if you type in Denver District Attorneys, it'll come up. It's like $20. But it's a good book. It's a history book. But when you look at it, I really think that we are in the middle. George, my partner, George Brockler, likes to say a tsunami in the rise of crime. And I think it's touching a lot of us. And if you look at the 3 reports that we've done with CSI, and I've got to tell you, to be part of this organization, to be a fellow, to work with these people that are bringing homelessness up to the public, crime up to the public, We got accused of punching below our weight or above our weight or something like that. And I said, thank God that CSI is doing this because people want to hear about what's going on. Throwing up the mic again. All right. They usually can hear me, but you know, I think that that was really what I thought was going to be the best part of our first study was, is this COVID related? Coming out of this horrible thing that the entire world went through, did that spike the crime rate? Or is it something that's been going on in our state for quite a bit longer? My sense was that it was a trend that had been going on most of the time that I was district attorney. What I was seeing was more of the habitual criminals, the active professional criminals being put out or let out on the streets. And there were a lot of things that came together there. There was also a reduction in the severity of crimes like auto theft, increasing the amount. When I started, it ages me a little, but when I started as a DA, the amount that you had to steal to be a felony was $200. It's currently $2,000. So when a ring of shoplifters hit Home Depot and steal below the felony amount, they're still stealing a lot. And since I'm not the DA anymore, I go to Home Depot a lot more than I used to. And I don't think I've ever spent $2,000 in a Home Depot. So when you're increasing that and you're diminishing these crimes, even though people consider maybe auto theft a minor crime, you're going to see this increase. Then when you have policies like one, I know are more, we have a report coming out on Thursday, by the way. So if you want to see these statistics, take a look at that report. We'll be doing a press conference on it. I was hoping there'd be some good news there. There's none. We're going to see another increase, and we're going to see billions of more dollars that this is costing the people of the state of Colorado. It went just in 1 year, it went up $7 billion, the cost from our first study to the second study. So it is costing us a lot of money, and it is costing the individuals that are victims of crime an awful lot. And so, you know I'm kind of rambling here, but I'll tell you the one good news out of our report. Last year, we had a historic number of homicides in the state of Colorado. That historic number is going to come down a little bit. Sadly, I don't think Denver's numbers are going to come down, but across the state, we're not going to see as many people murdered as we saw last year. But sadly, we're still number one in auto thefts. We're number one in the increase of property crimes in the state of in the United States. We're actually number two, but in property crimes, but the increased number is number one. Number one in bank robberies in the United States. Like I said, the good news is that homicide's there. The one thing I will tell you though, it was pretty dramatic reduction in fraud, because the fraud was related to the COVID money that was out there. And now that the COVID money's not out there anymore, the fraud rate has dropped down. So I guess they'll have to figure out another way to steal money from people or the government.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, that's one way to fix crime through policy is stop giving out COVID relief. But what other ways have you looked at? I mean, you obviously you trace some of this back to some changes in policy. What kind of policies are needed, and what kind of policies should people be thinking about as they go to the polls in terms of what might be needed to bring down the crime rate, and what are the upsides and downsides to people of those policies?
Well, I think that one of the examples, and we did a specific report on auto theft, and I think that people don't really realize that these are people that are professional auto thieves. I mean, we have a quote in there from Mike Greenwald. Mike said 97% of the people arrested in the last 3 years for auto theft have been arrested multiple times for auto theft. And then one of the more concerning things about that study was that the secondary offenses, the violent offenses that occur with an auto theft involved, they're on the increase as well. So 2014, when you basically make auto theft, I talked to a legislator the other day and he says, my goal this year is going to make auto theft a crime in Colorado again. And when you reduce it down to a level, and you've got all these people that are willing to steal cars, use cars in other crimes. One of the saddest stories I've seen in the last month was the man that was driving down I-70, a juvenile in a stolen car is driving like a wild person. He's not going fast enough. The juvenile pulls out his gun and shoots him in the head in another car. He crashes. The juvenile hits a semi, and you know what he runs into? Another stolen car. That shows you how prevalent this is. They start bouncing off each other, and half the cars in this deal are stolen cars. And of course, everybody jumps and runs, and it takes the Denver police over a month to run down this murderer. So don't think that with auto theft, well, it's just a crime where they're stealing cars. It's not. They're utilizing these cars in other kind of crimes, including violent crimes. And our study shows that. And the saddest thing about our auto theft study, I believe, is on who it impacts. You know, we're talking about the homeless. We're talking about people that need housing. You've got one car and it gets stolen. And those are the highest numbers of cars that get stolen. It's not the really expensive cars, it's the lower valued cars. And if you don't live in an area where you've got busing, how do you get your kid to school? How do you get to work? How do you get to the doctor to get the medical treatment that you need? Auto theft is a big problem in the state. And if you ask me, there are people starting to pay attention to it. If you're selecting who you're going to vote for, no matter what side they're on, you want to know what their position is going to be in trying to resolve this crime rate in the state of Colorado.
All right, well, thank you. I have a feeling we'll come back to that with questions too, but I want to move down to Jason now. Jason, you are also looking into a small policy called education. You've done a lot of work on that over the years. And I mean, your latest report offered insights to everything from school revenue to expenditures to education workforce, size of the student population, performance outcomes. There's a lot of places we can go here when we're talking about education and what people need to be thinking about when they think about the policies they want their elected leaders to put in place. Let's start with this one. There's been a lot of news about enrollment decline in public schools and across the state. Could you help us understand why this is happening, what it means, and what it means toward revenue that we need to fund schools?
Sure, I'll take a shot at that in a couple of ways. So in normal times, as you all probably know, but probably worth saying, based on Colorado's student funding formula, there's a certain dollar amount attached to each student. That's made up of three sources: your local property taxes, your state general fund, plus federal dollars. On average across the state, that's a dollar amount of about $14,000 per student. And so that's on the revenue side. And in normal times, there's always growth. For the last 10 years, there's been growth in the number of K-12 students across the state. So more students, increased funding. Then in the pandemic times, we saw a dramatic loss of students. 22,000 students were lost to Colorado's K-12 education system in school year 21. So 22,000 times 14,000 per student. That's a theoretic $308 million, again, theoretical loss, but education is not a rational marketplace, as you know. So lawmakers quickly scrambled and they passed policy to provide stabilization funding. That means hold harmless, no consequence for schools and districts who lost students. They still did not see a reduction in revenue. On top of that, an unprecedented increase in inflow of federal dollars came into the system. So if you're following me, in normal times, more students equal more revenue. in pandemic times, less students also equaled more revenue. So it's an irrational system. Policy can help. The worst part about both of these scenarios is that in neither case are students being served well in our public education system, particularly from an academic performance perspective.
Let's dig into that, because I think one of the things you're going to hear from candidates on both sides of this election is more education funding. It's been a call from both sides of the Capitol in recent years. But is there a correlation between higher funding and better outcomes? What do people need to think about when they're thinking about education funding and policy?
Sure. Over time, what we know is that there's a steady increase in funding. But what the data also tells us is that that funding is moving further and further away from the classroom. The expenditure on teacher salary definitely impacts the quality of education we're able to deliver. What is this? This is the growth comparison. Whereas over the last many years, what is it? The last 14 years, revenue for education has grown by 47%. Meanwhile, 47%. I can't see that very well. Meanwhile, teacher pay has only increased by a small fraction of that. So yes, it matters. That affects an ability to attract and retain quality teachers, which is a huge factor in the quality of education, which shapes the teaching and learning environment, both for the teacher experience and the student experience. And so what's so problematic about that is that even as revenue rises, how are we utilizing that money? And what are the impacts of that money? Here, right now, today in Colorado, only 41% of third graders are proficient at reading. That is a crisis. By the way, even worse in math, only 39% of students are proficient in math at the third grade level. Here's what we know. Up through third grade, you learn to read. Past third grade, you read to learn. If you never master the competencies of reading and writing by the third grade, you have very little chance of ever catching up. It is a doomed sentence for students who are cheated so significantly out of their early development years. And so, yes, there are arguments about whether or not we have a revenue problem. I'm not totally convinced. I know what we do have is an allocation problem in education.
And go down that road a little bit more, if you will, the allocation problem. Where are we lacking the allocations right now? And specifically, I mean, when we talk about teacher salaries, I mean, I think the debate has gone beyond, are we paying them enough, to how do we get enough people to staff our schools right now? How related is the teacher salary component to that? And how related is that to the performance measures as well?
Sure, I have lots of thoughts about that, but sticking to what we covered in the report, looking at the data alone. So whereas since the year 2000 up till now, there's been a 25% increase in the number of students. Compare that to an increase of 36% increase in the number of teachers versus a 73% increase in the number of principals and assistant principals, but then a whopping 132% increase in administrators. That tells me that there is a resource allocation issue that we just simply have to confront. So we're not spending the money as effectively as necessary. That has dramatic impacts on the student experience and their achievement, which touches on other interrelated and inextricably connected sectors of our state economy, namely workforce, the quality and the quantity of our much needed workforce. And so we're really crippling ourselves. I was talking to Larry before this event, and I always say education is not a social ill on par with the others: criminal justice, homelessness, any of those issues. Frankly, it's the nucleus. It's going to be very hard to fix any of the other problems until we get a handle on education.
All right, well, I want to, I've been looking at my watch, not because I'm bored, because I'm trying to keep track of the time here. And I wanted to open this up now to the audience. I think we've put out some good ideas for you to think about. What more do you want to hear about? Sir, we'll start with you. And I'll repeat those first in case everybody didn't hear it. The question is, what is affordable housing, both as defined in Proposition 123 and in this state? Take it away, Peter.
Yeah, so great question. The measure defines it via both rental and home ownership. And so for renters, based upon where you live, set at 60% of area median income and spending no more than 30% of your income monthly on your home. So that's called housing burdenness. To include utilities. On the home ownership side, that's switched, and that's 100% of AMI, and not spending more than 30% of your income on said housing to include utilities. And that's how the measure defines it. That is broadly, there is some debate within the housing world. Should that 30%, like, why is that the number? You know, should it be 40%? But essentially, what it means is, and is there units available at that price range, which there are not in Colorado. And so, you know, it's one thing, and I'll just share too, you know, like you can make a direct correlation between housing unit shortfalls, housing unit gaps, and increases in homelessness. And so when we look at Colorado and Denver, we look at LA, we look at San Francisco, you know, New York City, all of those places, areas that we have more housing, we have less homelessness, right? And so I think that that does not, you know, differ from what Larry was sharing in reference to some of the other socioeconomic factors, behaviors, et cetera. But if you have homes, generally you can place folks in. Permanent supportive housing is trying to address that. So I think that, you know, the question there is what's affordable, and do we have the stock to be able to align with what some folks are calling income aligned housing, right? So you can make $100,000 a year in Denver, and you could still struggle to be able to find a unit that you can afford, let alone find.
Thanks for that perspective. That's a startling number there.
So right now in America, there's only 46 available homes for every 100 folks in that construct that I just shared for Henry, I believe. And so, and it's even worse, it's about 26 for Colorado. And so, you know, again, it's an inventory dynamic.
Okay. Sir, you had a question.
This one's for Jason. My voice. 132% increase in administrator. It's my understanding that school districts are sort of like independently and locally governed, right? And so for all, you know, 97 school districts, to stay organic, not at all, deciding to increase the number of administrators, or is this something that can be state policy that's saying you need positions in the wrong area or federal? Or, and part of the question is like, what is the school district turnover? The Johnson School District, for instance, that gets that whole like common sense people on the board. Could they take a look at all the administrators, look at 5%, you know, like, let's make it look like that seems a lot of space, but we're like, what the heck, they're going to get out of it, right?
So the question for Jason was, why are we seeing such a spike in administrators, and in a state where local governance is key? How do we deal with this?
Okay. Listen, there's a lot of entrenched interest in the education system who are fighting, who are well organized and fighting for the comforts and convenience of adults in the system. You ask a good question. I reached out to the Colorado Association of School Executives when I was when I was writing an op-ed to describe the outcomes of this report. And I wanted to give them a chance to say, like, okay, why is this incredibly disproportionate increase? Is there a rationale for it? Does it somehow have an impact on student outcomes? First of all, I got no response. And second of all, the data already answers that question. No, there's not an interconnectedness with more administrative spending equaling better outcomes for for kids. And so it's just a decision that they are making. And yes, schools are locally governed, but they're governed by school boards. School board members are elected. There's a lot of special interests in the elections of those local school board members, and therefore it perpetuates the cycle in the system. And what I can tell you, because the data makes very clear, is that no, there's no rational correlation. There's no true justification for this disproportionate amount of spending that somehow trickles down and benefits students. That's just not there.
But to follow up on that, I mean, we are charging Colorado with local governance of school boards. So how do we deal with this from a statewide policy perspective? Or is it got to be everyone's got to shake their own school board and talk to them about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the school board is the highest authority in that jurisdiction. They make the ultimate decisions. And there is no way to fix the current system without affecting races at the school, affecting the composition of local school boards. And so how do we do that? Well, elections matter.
Okay. Let me look over this way. Sir, go ahead.
Sure, they're fairly consistent across regions. What's not consistent are things like teacher pay and turnover rates. Not surprisingly, there's a correlation between higher pay and lower teacher turnover, and that there's a difference across regions of the state. But these numbers pretty much hold true in terms of the disproportionate growth between the number of students and the number of other spending, teachers, principals, administrators.
Okay. Just because I ask you questions a lot, Mayor Kaufman, go ahead.
Very quick point. I think the first one, education, when I was state president of Colorado, school mismanagement, school financial. I didn't get yesterday. And I was wondering why they didn't do this. And I down to the budget, like 100% cut to the budget, and all the issues they function mechanically. After I do that, but let me just talk about affordable housing for a minute. That is that this ballot measure is not a clarified solution to the problem. It is a big government approach to pouring more money in. And so I just move forward with an aggressive water conservation program that I think is going to be modeled in the state. My next one is affordable housing, market-based affordable housing. It changes in design standards, changes in zoning. You can accomplish much more than what is going to be before the ballot. And I hope get this off the ground before voters will be told. I'm sure they'll be unfortunate, but I just don't think that this is traditional big government approach to destroying more money at the bottom. And there are three market solutions. The right people, we just have to have the courage as well as the election really to allow changes in design, changes in zoning, deal with bring down housing. We can do it.
Okay. Let me see if I can pull a question out of that one, Peter. Can you talk about what the role of free enterprise of private companies is in practice?
Well, yeah, I want to thank Mayor Kaufman for essentially paraphrasing Evelyn and I's report last year, which in this very room caught some controversy about the need for a free market in our housing. The housing industry is the last industry in the global economy to be disrupted, to be modernized. And as such, we have a acute stagnation of productivity gains throughout the industry players, right? And that is because we have too much red tape, too much pork, too much requirements. And it's really been in response to a lot of threats that we've received as Americans. How we put pretty much all of our nest egg and security into the equity of our homes. And so, it's really difficult for folks that are housed, that have lived through these volatile moments within our economy, of which we're in one right now, to say, go ahead, build more housing. I believe those stats that you're sharing. And so I think I applaud Mayor Kaufman, because those types of reforms are the root cause of this crisis, right? And so the ability for us to be able to do what we allowed our grandparents and our grandparents to do, to be able to maximize a piece of land, to be able to enhance what they own without significant overreach and influence by those that do not own their property. And so I think that's one element. The other element I'd say, is Ed, is this idea that, that we know the answers to these problems. There's copious evidence to what we can do via our land use planning and zoning methodologies to unlock not just affordable housing, but to unlock the entire housing continuum. And so if you want starter homes in your community, you got to do what Mayor Kaufman just suggested. If you want to be able to provide a continuum so our seniors who are overhoused, right, now have a place to be able to retire, but they're not ready to move into assisted living, well, then we have to tackle this condo defect challenge that just continues to plague us. 20% of our housing stock used to be attached for sale, condominiumized product. That is less than 9% now. Our developers want that. 6 companies build 40% of all the homes in the United States. Now, they're great companies, but some might call that monopoly, right? The reason that is occurring is because small businesses do not have the balance sheet and the opportunity cost to be able to compete. So they build homes. They're just building 100 homes or less in their territorial boundary, and their custom homes. And so, what my co-fellow and I coalesced around, and I know many of folks in this room, is that, we have to provide that American dream, and we have to allow that our Main Street small business providers to be able to enter into the space, innovate and modernize. And if you don't believe me, McKinsey and Associates did a fantastic study 2 years ago. They interviewed over 400 GC CEOs from across the world. Number one reason precluding affordable housing creation across the continuum, burdensome overregulation and a lack of regionality. That's the other thing I'd share, right? Is that, we have to push ourselves and stretch ourselves. If you don't like what Proposition 123 is selling you, then you have to ask yourselves, can we harmonize with other local governments? And Earl's looking at me, he's like, Peter, that's tough. But at the end of the day, right, it's not that far of a walk to say, why can't we have some shared design standards, land use planning and zoning methodologies, so developers like Peter or developers like many in the room can develop similar product with slight modifications from one side of Federal Boulevard to the other side, right? And so right now, we don't have that market. So everything is at its max cost because we have 0 economies of scale. And so what I would suggest is that if that is the free market solution that is singing to the ears of Coloradans, then that's what the measure didn't want to attack. The measure said local control will win the day, right? And so let's move through this construct because otherwise we will lose, right? And so it's a big question that we're going to answer for ourselves just in a couple months.
Okay, I got time for one last question here. I haven't gone to the back of the room, so sir in the back there.
Yeah, the connection between drugs and theft and violent crime, auto theft, is well documented. We made some changes to our drug laws a couple years ago, particularly fentanyl, and we changed it again last year to bring those levels down. We've seen an impact from that, or what is the current status on that?
The question was about the F word, fentanyl, and what are the changes that we have made and made again affecting in crime?
Well, I'll tell you, we address fentanyl in our new report. So Thursday, when our report comes out, there's a whole section on fentanyl. The good news is that the Colorado State Patrol is touting that they have seized over 400 pounds of fentanyl this year. That's enough. That's enough fentanyl to kill 93 million people. The sad thing is that they're not getting it all. It's still coming into our state. And this isn't something we grow here like some of our other narcotics. This is something that comes into our state and is killing people at an incredible rate. Our last report was 1,300 people overdosed primarily on fentanyl. This year, I think it's going to be about 1,500 people. So when we went from 3 Coloradans a day dying from fentanyl overdoses, unfortunately, I think that number's been up to 4 a day. One of the things that we really pushed, and when I say we, obviously the Common Sense Institute was bringing this stuff to the forefront, but when they went to say, okay, we made a mistake, fentanyl is so deadly, it should be a felony, no matter what amount. And people that deal this drug should not be getting PR bonds and released back into our communities because they're failing to appear at a 20% higher rate than anyone else is that's getting a PR bond. 50% of those people never come back to court and never get caught, and they are selling this poison on our streets. We have yet to see the impact that it will have. But when the legislature makes a mistake, and there is no doubt in my mind that making fentanyl a misdemeanor was a mistake, they dig it in their heels and they were not willing to make this poison a felony. I was a prosecutor when most drugs were felonies. And we knew how to deal with people that were addicted to narcotics. We had the oldest drug court in the United States. Bill Ritter started it. I had to save it and keep it funded. And it worked. But all of those people were facing felonies. So the idea that you've got to have this misdemeanor amount for something that kills as many people as fentanyl kills is ridiculous, because we knew how to deal with it. We knew how to deal with felony level narcotics and also get people that needed treatment, that needed to get out of the system and get clean and sober out. We knew how to do that. We didn't need to make those misdemeanors, which quite frankly made it harder to get the kind of treatment, the kind of seriousness that it takes to get somebody that's been addicted to a particular narcotic almost their whole life off and clean and sober. So I think there should be a move afoot to make fentanyl a felony. You know, if we had sawed-off shotguns, machine guns, sticks of dynamite, all those things everybody recognizes are incredibly dangerous products, and those products are all felonies. Fentanyl of any amount should be a felony in the state of Colorado.
Well, let's give one final hand to our panel. Peter, Larry, Mitch, Jason, thank you all very much for sharing your thoughts with us. And let's welcome Kristen back.